have some ambitious things tonight, and I want to spend some time and go through, of course, the scripture about the betrayal and the crucifixion of Christ. But many people wonder. A lot of people laugh sometimes when I say we have our Good Wednesday service, and I think that many people think you're just doing that because you like to have your services on Wednesday, so you just turned it around. But we all know that Jesus was crucified on a Friday. So if you want to take notes, good luck. It's not that late in here, but I'll give it to you, and you can find this later on online if you don't know it already. So here's a quick explanation. It's always good for you. Remember this. In Israel, even today, but in ancient Israel, of course, the day begins in the evening. All right, so it feels like a Wednesday to us, but it's really Thursday. It begins at sundown. The day begins at sundown. So that's the first thing to remember. Therefore, the Sabbath, when we think of Sabbath being a Saturday, it actually begins Friday evening, right? Also, you may not. This is one of those things that escapes us. But it was specified in Leviticus that after certain of the holidays, and Passover, of course, of all of them, and this is Passover. Passover actually begins this evening. You can tell that by the full moon. Passover's always on a full moon. So anyhow, so even at the Passover, there's a Sabbath. We think of a Sabbath being Saturday. But a Sabbath is a special day of rest. So there's a lot of Sabbaths besides Saturdays in the scripture. So when we think of after the Sabbath, they went to the tomb, we think after Saturday they went to the tomb. Well, they did. But Matthew 28, verse 1, this is your key verse. You can go there. It says Sabbath, but if you have a study Bible, it probably has it noted there that in the Greek it's Sabbaths. There were two Sabbaths. There was a Sabbath after the Passover, and then later on, of course, there was a Saturday Sabbath. So remember that. So if you want to think of a Wednesday crucifixion, I'll go through it quickly with you. If Jesus was, and you don't have to believe this, okay? It's not that all you have to believe is that Jesus was crucified for you, right? Amen. Whether you get the day right or not is not really such a big deal, but it will help you in a lot of ways. And then you won't laugh at us for doing good Wednesday services. But so for a Wednesday crucifixion to occur, Jesus was crucified. Remember, he was put on the cross at 9 a.m., and he, at noon, it went dark, and by 3 p.m., he had died, right? And at that time, if you're familiar with the temple sacrifice system, the evening sacrifice was already happening at 3 p.m., because as the first star could be seen, then it was becoming Thursday. So Wednesday evening, from our standpoint, is actually Thursday. We'll call it evening, but it's dark. It's beginning of the day, Thursday. So Thursday, the day for us, is actually then Friday evening. Friday during the day is actually Saturday evening. You with me so far? Yeah. Now remember this in Matthew chapter 12. You guys said you were, but those people don't sound like they are. But okay. Well, you can tell them later on what I said, okay? Remember this, Matthew chapter 12. There, the Pharisees are looking for a sign. He says, you're always looking for a sign. And he said, no sign will be given to you except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now watch this. He gives you an equivalence. Just as. Now Jesus doesn't mess around with his words. He doesn't schmooze like we do. He's precise. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, not a whale, the great fish, so, there's an equal sign there. So the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So he couldn't be 3.5 days and 2 nights. It has to be 3 days and 3 nights. You have to go by whether you believe him or not. And if he says that, how do you get there? I just told you. So that may not be all that clear to some of you, clear as mud maybe. But hopefully it'll begin to sink in. It helped me when I started to process through that, because I always used to wonder, how do you get there? How do you get there? It doesn't work from a Friday. Someone asked me this morning, when did all that start? It started a long time ago. It began before Roman Catholicism. There was a move to distance the church from anything Israel. Early on, even in the first century, that was happening. And which is a bad deal. But so that happened, and then, of course, the Roman Catholic Church reinforce that. And that's the reason you can never really get, it's only by chance, you'd say, that Passover is actually so close to Easter this year. Otherwise, you've been around and watched this stuff long enough. Sometimes Passover is like 10 days away from this because they did that on purpose. Anyhow, all right, so I'm going to be moving between Matthew and Luke and John tonight. If you want to try to follow along, you're welcome. But I'm just going to walk through this. So Jesus has had the guys at what we call the Last Supper, right? But it was a Passover Seder, really, that he was leading. And if you were here last year or you've been with us before when Mitch Treisman has been here and led us through the Seder, which only means order in Hebrew, but it's a remembrance of what God did with ancient Israel in bringing them out of Egypt. And so it's a remembrance of that, and Jesus used that same tradition, that meal at the Passover, as a way of speaking about himself. And then he takes elements that were already in the Passover Seder, and he takes the bread from it, because the father in the home in a Seder is actually breaking up the bread at the end of the night in little pieces, kind of like what we do, and passes them around to his family. And usually has some sort of something he wants them to know that's going to take them through the year. And then they all drink from a common cup of wine as they go through the evening. Jesus took those elements that were there in ancient times, but he modified it to speak of his body and his blood. So after they'd done that, they crossed the city, and it was a walk to go from where most people assume the upper room was. They crossed what we call the Old City. And if you recall, there's Mount Moriah, and then there's a valley called the Kidron Valley, and then there's the Mount of Olives on the eastern side. So they would have walked across the city, Mount Moriah, or the city of David, basically, and they would have come down the Kidron Valley and would have gone into the garden at the base of the Mount of Olives called the Garden of Gethsemane, or Gat Shemamim, which is where the olive press was. It really means the Garden of the Olive Press. And the olive trees were there. Same olive trees, by the way, that are there today. The same roots of those olive trees. Even those olive trees have been cut down in many conquests of Israel over the years. Those are the same olive roots. They keep growing. So they bear witness today to what happened there 2,000 years ago. And I've often wondered what it was like for Jesus as he crossed the Kidron. The blood, Josephus said there were more than 250,000 lambs that were sacrificed on Passover. And all that blood has to go somewhere. And there was a drainage system from the Temple Mount area that would take all the blood and the water that washed it down through a drainage system into the Kidron. Kidron means black, like rotted blood, black, and then takes it out to the Dead Sea. And I've often wondered what it's like for Jesus to cross the Kidron Valley on the little bridge they had there, to smell the stench of that rotted blood, thinking of all those lambs, and that he's the Lamb of God who would soon pay for the price to take away the sins of the world. And so we read here, let's see, I'll pick up around chapter 26 of Matthew. I'm going to read some, talk some, that's what I do. So it says here, around verse 36, Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." And he went a little farther, and he fell on his face, and he prayed, saying, "O Father, if it's possible, let this cup," that would be the cup that he was about to drink for us, the cup of the full strength of the wrath of God. "If it's possible, my Father, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." And then he walked back to the disciples, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "What, could you not watch with me even for 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, a second time he went away and he prayed, "Oh, my Father, this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, then your will be done." And he came and he found them again asleep, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and he went away again, and he prayed the third time, saying the same words. And then he came to the disciples and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, The hour is at hand, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Let's rise and let's be going. Behold, my betrayer is at hand. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. You'll recall that what has happened at this point is that Judas had left the dinner and had gone over to give the pieces back. He said, I can't do it. I've betrayed, innocent blood. So Satan is speaking through Judas that this is innocent blood he's betrayed. And they said, what's that to us? You keep it. And so he had said earlier, he made an arrangement with the temple guards. The one I kiss is the one. For years I used to think, what's this kissing thing going on here? Like, what's this all about? But this is a very Middle Eastern kiss, you embrace one another, kiss on each cheek. That's the kiss. Well, why would he do that? I mean, this is Jesus. Everybody knows him, right? But that's not true. He looked like any other man. He looked like any other Middle Eastern man. I mean, he wasn't a foot taller than anybody else. He didn't have a big M, Messiah, on his chest. He didn't glow in the dark. He didn't have a halo. All that artwork is wrong. He was just a guy in that regard, right? And so the way to identify him, he's saying, I'll kiss him. That's how you know who to arrest. And now his betrayer had given them a sign saying, whoever I kiss, he's the one, seize him. And immediately he went up, greetings, Rabbi, and he kissed him. But Jesus said to him, friend, why have you come? And then they came and they laid hands on Jesus and they took him. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand. We know that's Peter. He drew his sword and he struck the servant of the high priest and he cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, put your sword in its place, for all who live takes by the sword will perish by the sword. And then he goes on from there. Luke tells us that he took the ear. Imagine this, taking up Malchus's out. Malchus has got to be holding his head. I mean, this is not a flesh wound, I mean, this is a big deal. And he takes the ear and he puts it on his head. I mean, it's almost one of those, it's not a throwaway line, it's the Bible, but if it was a play or something, we'd say it's a throwaway line. It's one of those things, it's just an incidental thing. He completely healed him. What's Malchus left thinking after that? I mean, there's all these pieces in Scripture that, even now, I'm just taking up lots of time, but I mean, those things that are worth really considering. There's a Bible study in every single one of these little vignettes. Malchus is a really important part of that. Over in verse 57, I think, yeah. And those who laid hold of Jesus took him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had been assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's court, and he went in and he sat with the servants to see the end of things. And now the chief priests, the elders, and the council, they sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none, even though many witnesses came forward, but they found none. At last, 2 false witnesses came forward. And they said, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and he said to him, do you answer nothing? Why is it that these men testify? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. Like, what's the use? Why argue at that point? And the high priest answered, and he said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Now tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said, it's as you say. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest tore his clothes, and he said, he's spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look now, you've heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, and they said, he's deserving of death. And they spat in his face, and they beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands. And they said, prophesy to us, Christ. Who is this one who struck you? They could have, and think about this. Saul of Tarsus is a member of the Sanhedrin. That's who's there. Now, it doesn't tell us that all the Sanhedrin, that's 70 leaders, and we refer to this on Sunday. So you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees are 2 major parties who made up the Sanhedrin, but Paul is a Pharisee, and he's a Pharisee. He's the big deal Pharisee. His father was a Pharisee. He's a Pharisee. He's one of the smartest men around. He's sitting there. What's he thinking? I mean, he was consenting. We read later on in Acts chapter 7. He was consenting to this, but what's he taking in? I just find, and they could have asked him all sorts of questions. If you think about this, these are men who knew the Bible. If this man really is Messiah, of course we know he is, but I mean, from their perspective, if he's really Messiah, well then let's ask some questions. Let's put him to the test. They were setting him up to find blasphemy. They already had a preconceived notion that any man who says he's the Messiah is a blasphemer. But had they asked some other questions, had they asked him, are you the seed of the woman? Are you the Messiah? Are you the hope of our nation? Are you the one around whom all of our hopes have been centered? Are you the one who will usher in the kingdom? They could have asked those kinds of questions and gotten into, they knew that they could never win an argument with them, right? We read that through the Gospels. They never win an argument with this guy. So they could have, if they wanted to, humility is a great thing when we employ it. They could have asked some great questions and gotten some profound answers. But they weren't interested in that. All they wanted, since in their mind he didn't profile as the Son of God, he had to be the wrong one. Outside, in the midst of all this, Peter is denying that he even knows the Lord. An hour and a half earlier, he said, I'll never leave you, even if all these guys, even if they all desert you, I'll never leave you. I'll go to prison. I'll even go to death for you. 3 times he's asked, wait a minute, didn't I see you with him? That wasn't me. Wait, but you speak like a Galilean. Your words betray you, because Galileans were like, they're hicks from the perspective of someone living in Jerusalem. And you sound like that. And he said, not me. And finally he caves the 3rd time in front of a middle school girl, a servant girl. And he said, I tell you, and he swore, meaning he swore a curse upon himself if he was lying. That's what it means by he swore. I don't even know him. And immediately the rooster crowed. Luke tells us about how Jesus is walking through the courtyard at that time, and their eyes meet. What was the look on Jesus' face? Have you ever wondered about that one? Sometimes, I've heard people say, kind of that, I told you so. I don't think so. I mean, of course Jesus knew. But it had to be one of compassion was said over here, and love. But Peter, the bitterness of it all, he ends up leaving, crying, and he tried to get as far away as possible. And by the way, this whole trial is a kangaroo court. They broke so many laws. They broke at least 15 rules for a capital, when there was a capital criminal, someone accused of a capital crime, I should say. There were certain things that the Sanhedrin had to do. It was illegal for the Sanhedrin to meet at night. It was all of their proceedings had to happen in the daytime, and if it was a capital offense and they found the defendant guilty, they had to sleep on it. The rule was they had to sleep on it and then come back the next day and still be, I guess it had to be unity. They had to be uniform in their opinion before they cast sentence. They had to produce at least 2 witnesses who had been interrogated separately, who could agree. They couldn't do any of that. And then Jesus is brought to Pilate around chapter 27. We'll pick up down around verse 11. And Jesus stood before the governor. They brought him to Pilate. Now, by the way, this is early the next morning, right? So they went through the night. As some of you who've been with us to Israel, we go to Caiaphas' house, and some of you might remember that. And there's some interesting mystery about this. Not everybody always believes this, but there is a cell where they would have kept a prisoner in those days, and presumably where Jesus would have been kept overnight, Caiaphas' house, before they took him out in the morning. And there's an image on the wall that many believe was an image that was supernaturally put on the wall where Jesus was. I don't know that. I'm just saying those things are interesting. So they bring him to Pilate, and like I said, this is early in the morning. Jesus is going to be on the cross by 9 a.m. they've come across the city, and I mean across the city, because where they lived and where Pilate, the governor's residence, were pretty good. It was a stiff walk. And so they had to get there early. When you consider all the things that happened before he actually got on the cross, I don't know that Pilate's even had his coffee yet, right? I mean, he can't be a happy camper in the first place. Seriously, he hates the Jews. And many people often think that Pilate may be off the hook here, that we're going to see him in heaven someday. And I'm not inclined to believe that. He was not on good terms with Rome because he didn't keep control over those Jews from Rome's perspective. And so he doesn't know how to convict Jesus. Well, let me read some. See, when we do it that way. So now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Because that's what they're accusing you of. They brought you up on charges saying that you're the king of the Jews. So are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, "It's as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he answered nothing. And Pilate said to him, "Don't you hear how many things they testify against you?" I mean, it's the two of them in a room, but there's the other guys there. So he said this, and he said that, and he did this, and he claims this. Don't you hear the stuff that they're saying about you? But Jesus didn't answer him a word, so that the governor marveled greatly. In fact, John will say, if I'm not mistaken, it's John, who says, if I was truly one who was going to throw over your kingdom, my servants would have risen up to overthrow you. And Pilate's marveling by what, I mean, you have to get this. From Pilate's perspective, he's the big dog in the room. He's the governor. He's appointed by Caesar. And Jesus is beaten up, bloodied. He's from the Galilee. He's a nobody. He's a nobody. From Pilate's perspective, he's a nobody. But the wisdom that's being exercised, he's not arguing for himself, and he's saying, look, yeah, they said that, but this is really the way he's not doing any of that stuff like any of us would be. I mean, you think of, I know I read it a lot, but, like during communions and all, about Isaiah 53. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before its shears is silent, yet he opened not his mouth. He was accused of all these things. And even though he was accused of things that he himself was not guilty of, but because he was taking my place and your place, he had nothing to defend for because he was taking my place. So the accusations he couldn't argue with. You have to sort of look through all of that to see what's going on here. And now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to doing, they had a custom that they would do every year on Passover, and where he would release to the multitude one prisoner whom they desired, someone who was guilty of a capital crime, who would have gone to the cross to show how merciful he was. He would release a prisoner. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. And most of you might know this, but Bar is son, Abba, father, son of the Father. So here you have Jesus, who is the son of the Father, right? Yeah. And you have another one, Barabbas, son of the Father. Wow. The wordplay that's going on is fascinating. Some of these things you don't always see. They're in Greek or Hebrew, some of those things you see, but you don't see it in English all the time. But this is one you do. They had this notorious prisoner, Barabbas, and therefore when they had gathered them together, Pilate said to them, "Well, whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. He was, Rome may not like him, but he's still a smart guy. He can read human nature. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." So Pilate's got to be really conflicted. You got to sort of put yourself in his situation. It's easy enough to have compassion for the guy. He's been put into a position he doesn't want to be in. He wants to be out of this because he can tell that whoever this Jesus is, he's not guilty of something that's deserving of death. let alone crucifixion. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Jesus or Barabbas? That's the question that you come up with here. So the governor answered, and he said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "Well, what then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Messiah?" And they all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." Now, by the way, people often will say that the same crowd who on Sunday, 4 days earlier, were praising him, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, has turned their heart. No. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm not, I don't know, I wasn't there. But this is a setup. This is a setup. And so the chief priests, the Pharisees, all these guys, they've set this up. So they've gotten all the guys who agree with them to be there. And they're persuading, they're doing everything possible to persuade Pilate. That's only my opinion. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of other things. So why? What has he done? Let him be crucified. And Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising. He took water and he washed his hands before the multitude. And he said, "I am innocent of the blood of this just man. You see to it." And all the people answered, this staggers me every time I read it, especially when you consider what happened over the next 2,000 years. "Let his blood be upon us." Because the blood's got to be on someone's hands. God says the blood's going to be on someone's hands. Pilate has said, "I'm innocent of this." They said, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." That's exactly what Jesus said 4 days earlier. Because you didn't recognize this day the things that would be for your peace, now they're hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and hem you and your children in on every side and slaughter them within your walls. 1.5 million died 38 years later because of this. Because of this. Because of this. What you do with Jesus is always the question. What will you do with Jesus? Many of us in here tonight, we've done something with Jesus. We said, "He's my Savior. He paid the price for my sins." But there are others in here tonight who have also done something with Jesus. They've said, "I want nothing to do with him." You really want his blood that way on you? Because that makes you guilty of this. I've often, mused about this. Picture yourself. You're Barabbas. You are guilty, and you know you're guilty. And you're in the prison. You know you deserve to go to that cross, and you've seen enough crucifixions to know what's involved in this. And so now, because you're guilty of all these things and murder, you're going to go. You don't know there's a negotiation going on outside. You're in a hole in the ground. But what you're hearing is what? Barabbas! Crucify him! Barabbas! Crucify him! Barabbas! Crucify him! That's what he's hearing. He knows he's a dead man. He knows exactly. And now what's it going to be like for him? When a guard comes and takes him out of the hole, and walks him out past Pilate and this bloodied man standing there. Jesus, the real Son of the Father. He doesn't get it yet, but he's going to get it momentarily, that man has now taken your place. Do you realize what you deserve if you don't know Jesus Christ? Hell. And yet someone has taken your place. Jesus has taken. You're Barabbas. I'm Barabbas. I was set free because of what Jesus Christ did for me. So he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. They scourged Jesus. And this scourging, there's this idea that people have about the scourging. We often hear in other parts of the Scripture about the beatings and the scourgings, for example, that Paul took. And there was a Jewish rule, not a Bible verse, a Jewish rule, that they didn't want to be guilty of over-punishing a man. So if the man deserved 40 lashes, they would always lash him with 39, because they didn't want to get in trouble with God for going over. They'd rather, err on this side of it. Many people have a tendency to believe that that's what happened here, that Jesus took 39 lashes. No, he didn't. The Romans are not living by that rule. That's a Jewish rule. The Romans used the flagellum. They would tear off a man's clothes and tie him over a beam. And the flagellum were long pieces of leather that have lead balls, shells, glass, things like that in them. And with every strike of, there's usually something like a dozen or more of these leather straps with all of that stuff. And it was designed to, think of tenderizing meat. That's what the lead balls were doing. And while that was happening, 40 or whatever times, the reason the Romans did it was to get a prisoner to confess. If the prisoner would confess early, the soldier would go light on him. He'd go easy on him. But if he wouldn't confess, they'd go harder and harder and harder until he did confess. What does Jesus have to confess? And the whole idea of tenderizing the meat, so to speak, and now tearing the flesh, don't think just the outside flesh. Would dig down, organs would be exposed. There'd be excessive bleeding. Sometimes there were reports, Josephus talks of ribs flying out. It wasn't, I said as a negative, it was common for a prisoner to die during the scourging before he ever got to the cross, okay? Jesus endured all that, and then he was taken out to the cross. Luke tells us this, says that they took him out to the cross. Actually, as they're leading him away, we read this in verse 26. As they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon of Cyrene. Simon the Cyrenian is from Libya. Okay, so if you have a picture in your mind of where Israel is and where Libya is, northern Africa, he's traveled all that distance. It was a mandatory feast, Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. Mandatory feast. Every able-bodied man was required to get there. But because of the diaspora, the first diaspora, there's so many Jews living all over the world, they couldn't get there for every one of these feasts if they lived that far away. Here's a man who's always wanted to go to Passover. How many times has he been there? I don't know, but it's not like he went every year. Here's a man who's just journeyed 800 miles, no tour bus, he didn't fly, he walked. Maybe he had an animal of some sort he could ride on. He's spent all that money, and he's traveled all that distance. He's an obedient Jew, and he comes to Jerusalem. Wrong place at the wrong time? Or is it the right place at the right time? Because the Roman soldier forces him to carry Jesus' cross for him. Simon's got to be thinking, you've got to be kidding me. After all this, now I've got blood on me. I'm going to be ritually impure. I can't take part in Passover. I can't do any of those things that I came to do. Think of that. And yet we read later on, Mark tells us, Paul tells us, Simon has these two sons, one Alexander and the other Rufus, who are both believers. So their dad trusted Christ. Now his family trusts Christ. Anyhow, they take him to the cross. And at this point, as they bring him up, the Bible tells us they took him to Calvary. If you have King James, it says Calvary. New King James says Calvary. NIV says Golgotha. Golgotha was the Aramaic word for place of the skull. Greek calls it cranion. Latin calls it Calvaria. So it comes into the English to us as Calvary. But it's the place of the skull. When Herod had quarried everything off the Temple Mount area to build this enormous temple, he left this one part where he'd done all this quarrying. You can still see it today. Eye sockets, nose, mouth. It's the place of a skull. Calvary. So people ask you, where do you go to church? You go to Skull Chapel. So they took him there. Many mocked him. But we read, when they had come to the place, 33, called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right, one on the left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them. Who's he talking about? He's talking about these men who are nailing him to the crossbeam and to the upright while it's still on the ground. And the idea here is that he's continuing to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. It's like involuntary manslaughter is what he's saying. Who's he talking about? The soldiers who's doing this to him. And look, this was an assignment. If you were one of the soldiers doing this, that was your job. You nailed people to the cross all the time. There are a lot of crucifixions. You know, we didn't get to put in a song tonight we'd love to sing, but, you know, that old rugged cross. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. And, well, it was on a hill far away. It was on Moriah. But we have this image sometimes that it was up on top of the hill, and the three crosses were up there, and the people were down here. No, the Romans set those crosses right in front of you on the road. So the point was that when you walked by, you were able to look in the eyes of this man. Rome wanted you to know, you don't want what happened to this guy to happen to you. Rome had invented the worst form of punishment that would keep a man alive as long as possible before he actually died. And remember, the leaders went to Pilate at one point and asked for the soldiers to break the legs of the men on the cross. Why? Because they wanted to get on with Passover. They didn't want to defile the day. And Pilate allowed them to do that. When they got there, Jesus had already died, right? Jesus said, no one takes my life away from me. I give it up. I lay it down on my own, and I'll take it up again. But the others, they had to break their legs. Why? So that the whole idea, I can't get into all this, but the idea was that you had a little shelf for your butt. You could almost get it on, but your feet were nailed to the upright like this. So at the expense of great pain, you pushed up just so you could get some air in your lungs, and then you sink down again. The pain would start over. And we think hours on the cross. No, that's what happened here. There are reports of some 9 days, 15 days. The jackals would come by and start eating the feet. Am I grossing you out enough? But I want you to understand how terrifying this was. And Jesus endured that for you. And of course, in the middle of it all, at noon, great darkness came over the earth. I believe it was darkness like would have been felt in the plagues in Egypt. And it was during that time that there was an earthquake, a terrifying earthquake, and the veil in the temple was torn from the top to the bottom. God was saying, the old system is over, and we are open for business. All who will may come in. Because now it's open to everyone. For those next 3 hours, the first 3 hours of daylight, the second 3 hours of absolute darkness. And when they came to break the legs of the prisoners, you know what happened. They came to Jesus, he was already dead. And one of the soldiers pierced his side with a sword, and blood and water flowed out. And I want to leave you here with this. We read this in John chapter 19, that after this, after he died, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. Remember, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and so was Joseph of Arimathea and also Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and he took the body. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. This is a ton of money. Listen, they took the body of Jesus, and then it describes how they bound it with strips of linen and with spices, as was the custom of the Jews to bury. What was that like? Think of the love involved. To ascend that cross on this wooden ladder and take his hands off of those nails and to take the full weight of this man, full of blood. I mean, Isaiah says he had no appearance even as a man anymore. It's horrifying. But to take the full weight of his body and to come down that cross and lay him on the slab and begin to wrap him. That's love. I don't know that we often get this because we just read it quickly and we've read it fairly quickly tonight. We can't go much further.